introduction.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I wasn't sure if I was going to take off my coat because it's so dang cold out there. I took off my coat, but I kept on my scarf. So, my name is Cliff Nelson. If you don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the Wando Christian Legal Center and the Vice Chair of the Legal Aid Committee this year. I was off to a slow start this year because the first meeting in August, I had my third baby, a little baby boy that was born right around the meeting. Thank you. I brought home a puppy a week later, which was a ridiculous decision I made. And then I missed the second meeting because it was scheduled during a time when I didn't have it in my calendar because somebody else scheduled me while I was on maternity leave. So, anyway, it's nice to be with you all. Olga, who's the president or chair of this committee, sends her greetings. She wasn't able to make it today. She has a staff Christmas party. Asked me to step up and host today's panel. I thought it was the least I could do for her, seeing as though I haven't done much yet. We have a privilege today to hear a panel of experts on domestic violence regarding this domestic violence outcome measures report, the first of its kind nationally, that was prepared by the Battered Women's Network. This report chronicles experiences and needs of survivors, and I am literally reading from your agenda, so you can read with me. Experiences and needs of survivors of domestic violence at the time they first engaged with services and then 6 months later. And of those services that were identified, legal services was high on that list, which for someone like myself who's not in this field was a surprise to me. So that makes it particularly relevant to our group today, and we're looking to see if we can have a discussion on how to do this collaboratively and holistically to better serve those who have survived domestic violence. So with that, I will introduce the panel. We have Megan Rose, immediately to my left. She's the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Public Policy for the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network. Megan is licensed to practice law in Illinois, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and has experience as a family law attorney. Amy Fox is the Deputy Executive Director, all the way down at the end, of Lifespan, a domestic violence agency providing counseling and civil legal services for victims of domestic and sexual violence. And she's been licensed in Illinois since 1998 and specializes in family law. And then last but not least, Margaret Duvall is the Executive Director of the Domestic Violence Legal Clinic, a nonprofit, as we know, dedicated to legal advocacy on behalf of victims of domestic violence. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel to take us from here.
Thank you. We're focusing on the highlights today, and we've really tried to tailor the presentation and the discussion to what may be relevant to you all as legal aid practitioners. So just a bit of background about the project. I mentioned 15 participating member agencies over a period of 3 years. This partnership successfully collected information from around 450 survivors of domestic violence. And the goal was really to determine the effectiveness of our programs, our existing services, with the hopes that the information would help us lead to the development of more meaningful programming and help us guide collaborations, as well as policy and legislative efforts, and identify key funding priorities. I think many of us in the room know that outcomes are having a moment, that funders want to know. They want proof that what the services that they support are working for clients, for survivors of domestic violence in particular. And so this project really came about through conversations with the Chicago Community Trust and our former executive director, having discussions about just that. Was what we were doing, was it working? And so I think a lot of times we collect information, we collect data to justify funding or to report back about deliverables, but this was really the first effort to create community-driven data to give feedback on the services we're providing beyond what we were required to do in grant reporting. So that goal was to create a process to both collect that data and analyze it on an ongoing basis. And the hope, and I think we're moving in that direction, is to do that in more real time so that we can truly be responsive to the needs of survivors of domestic violence. So I've mentioned some of the other goals: driving program development, assessing current service responsiveness to survivor needs, target needed collaborations, and identify legislative and policy priorities. And so those are some of the things that we're going to be asking you about as we look issue by issue at the services survivors reported they needed to sustain their safety. So I'd like to turn my attention now to my colleagues and sister members of the Chicago Metropolitan Battered Women's Network to talk a little bit about why they chose to engage in the project and some thoughts they had at the outset, as well as the data collection began. So I know for many of us, the thought of conducting another survey or another intake form or another recruitment tool with a client, I think becomes a challenge to think about incorporating yet another piece into what we do. And so I'd like to first ask Margaret or Amy, what interested you in the project and what challenges you anticipated in your participation in the project?
Happy to take a stab at that. This project launched at about the time that I joined the Domestic Violence Legal Clinic, and so it was early in my time there. And what I remember initially thinking was, we can't be the only ones who don't do this. So I think it was a little bit of the power of the collaborative, and that there was a critical mass that was moving towards this. And at the same time, some concerns that I had. We put some resources into this. We put staff resources into it. And I think Amy can talk more about that. But we are also asking a lot of our clients, and when people come into our office, they are in crisis. It is at a moment that they are presenting with a lot of needs, and we're asked to do a lot for them really fast. We are also asking a lot of them. We are, in addition to asking them questions relevant to their case, we are asked by a variety of funders to administer surveys. And so the idea of administering another survey or asking someone to provide that information was something that did give us pause, and we wanted to be very careful about that. But to the point of outcomes, and I think they're having a moment, and I think the moment's going to stick around for a while, and we sort of I guess push back about that a little bit sometimes, because it's difficult sometimes to say, well, how do you know what you're doing is working when we don't know what happens to our clients 6 months afterwards or a year afterwards. They're not a population that is easy to track down. They're not necessarily coming back to us to tell success stories. They come back to us when they need more help. They do come back with success stories, but anecdotal and not necessarily something that we could report on. But when I was thinking more about outcomes and kind of why we need to take ownership of how we define them, and if you'll forgive the parenting analogy, it's a weakness of mine, but it's ask my kids, have you brushed your teeth? Yes. I see toothbrush on the toothpaste. I smell toothpaste on their breath. But if they're still getting cavities, there's something wrong in that process. So we need to examine what is I can say, yes, I'm doing this activity all the time, but until we're getting the impact and the outcomes that we're striving for, then something is not, maybe we need to add flossing. There's something that's not going well there.
Thank you.
It could just be. Or it could just be them. Yeah.
Lifestone, when we first heard about the project, I think we had a range of emotions and thoughts. We think, that's overwhelming. It's new. One thing about this project that also makes it unique is that it is a long-term evaluation, so that it starts. Did we talk about this?
Let's talk about it.
Okay. I've done this so many times. That what happens is that we enroll clients really not early on in the process, but you enroll them in the project, but then you check in with them monthly for 6 months. And then the actual evaluation, there's an evaluation when they're first enrolled, and then the final evaluation is the comparison one at 6 months out. So you think, how are we going to have capacity? A number of issues run through our head. How are we going to have staff capacity to devote to this project when, it's not funded, so our participation is voluntary, so it's not as though we can increase staff. So we're asking more of our staff that are already overburdened and overtaxed and sick of forms. So we knew we had to get staff buy-in. But then also, given the nature of the clients that we work with, victims of domestic violence, it may not be safe to contact them monthly for up to 6 months. we may not be able to contact them in monthly or at 6 months because their phone died, or they dropped out of services, or they were evicted. So it's the nature of all of our clients. You get that. So that was a major concern. But we were driven to participate for a variety of reasons. One, funders. You covered that. Two, a desire to have sort of consistent outcome measures across DV providers. So if we are all trying to show the value of our work, that either to funders or the community or other collaborators, that we have to be talking about the same thing and that we have to be consistent in our measurement. And so this provided us a platform for that. So that was a huge driving force for us.
Yeah, I think the ability to benchmark, and then as you adjust service offerings or you partner with someone you haven't partnered before to develop a collaboration, I think it helps assess whether those initiatives are working. And I think that that's something that is, difficult sometimes to quantify. And so this offered kind of a leveling of that information. I think that one thing I'd like you to talk about too is some of the adjustments that were made as the project was taking shape in terms of recruitment. So you heard Amy mention that participants in the survey were recruited at the time they engaged services. And I know in the beginning there were certain parameters. So folks who were in shelter, so there were 4 core services from where the participants were recruited, and those were shelter, legal advocacy, legal representation, and counseling. And I know that there were adjustments made within participants in the project depending on what service a participant engaged in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, well, sure. And I would just jump back to another point is that this gave us the opportunity to define these metrics ourselves. And so we spent months, it was, you guys can imagine the joy of having 40 professionals in a room wordsmithing the questions that we were going to ask the participants. But that was a really important part of the process. And so it allowed us to say, this is what we want to know from our clients. And so I think that was really crucial. In terms of the adjustments that we made, I think that the adjustment was larger on the legal advocacy side. So people who are not lawyers but who are providing legal services within the courthouse context usually. And it had to do with at what point are we asking them to participate. And so the first time, as I said, that they come into court when they are in crisis. Turns out that's not a great time to ask somebody, do you want to get in touch with me every time, once a month for 6 months. It's a little too much for that first contact. So I don't know if there's anything.
When you use the analogy of picking out curtains while the house is on fire.
I mean, I think a lot of the tweaking was really just minor, but had a huge impact. Clients were actually given financial incentives via a gift card at the end of the project. And so there used to be originally they would get a $5 towards their overall gift card in the end if they were to contact the agency, and the burden was on them. But then we sort of loosened it a little and said, well, but if you had contact with them to verify their address, they can still get the $5. So it's little things like that, but things that made a huge impact because then clients were more likely to pursue, even if maybe they missed a month, they wouldn't just drop out. We'd say, don't worry, you're still on track, you still have your money, you still can receive your full $60 gift card at the end of 6 months. It really just was another small incentive. So it was minor tweaks like that.
Yeah, I think the incentive piece for participation was crucial, and I think it really helped folks stay engaged with us in whatever way, whether that was picking up our calls or making calls to the participating agencies where they receive service. Any additional thoughts sort of about what you hoped to learn or what challenges you anticipated by participating in the project before we turn our attention to some of the major findings?
I mean, just one additional thing that, to be honest, I don't know if this is arrogance or experience, and maybe experience with other outcomes, we didn't think we'd learn anything new, but we did it anyways, because we didn't know what we didn't know. So that's one little comment that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I mean, thinking across our membership at the Battered Women's Network, and that doesn't exclude the 15 participating member agencies. I think many of us know anecdotally that what we offer is helpful. I think when it comes to quantifying that, that's where the challenge is. And so I think that this offered a way for us to have the numbers to support what we know in our hearts to be true.
And I think we were also really interested to find out, and again, we did have confidence about this, but we're hoping to see it in the results, the value of legal services for survivors. And because we knew that we were part of a survey that included counseling, that included lots of other services, and so we anticipated, and in fact we did see that legal services were such an important part of what survivors need.
Oh, one other motivating factor for us was if participating agencies achieve a certain number of clients participating, then they earn an individual agency report, which was really a driving force for us as well. So that not only at this point we have this outcomes report that's for all member agencies, but Lifespan, other agencies, they enrolled enough clients that in January we will get our own report. So that's more intriguing to me, because then we can compare and see did our success, was it less than overall agencies, was it greater than, and then we can start sort of extrapolating if it is better or worse, what the factors were, because our services may be different than other member agencies.
That's great. I think that there are several agencies that are about at that threshold or have already reached it to receive an individualized report from the researchers, and I think they all are, have the same level of anticipation for what it will tell them about the services that they offer or should offer, or maybe should think about not offering, right? I think that one of the things that I know, I had been working at a participating agency and then transitioned into this role about 1.5 years ago, and one thing I expected to see, and we'll cover it later, is that areas where our community needed to collaborate or needed to be thoughtful about deficits in what we offered, and then really having conversations about what was within our capacity to offer ourselves and where we should look externally to other experts in those fields and think hard about partnering in significant ways. And so with that, I think I'll just turn our attention to the core services. So if you are following along at home, or with your slides, I should say, we'll be looking now at the core services slide, so the first one on the top of the second page. And, as we've alluded to, I think the great news is that our core services, our services that meet the immediate safety needs of survivors, are working and are worth the investment. So you heard me list those off. Those are shelter, counseling, legal and court advocacy services. So the respondents to the survey reported that these services helped a great deal with emergency safety, and most participants reported not, having emergency safety needs at the time they completed the survey. It was no longer a primary concern. That services were very effective, and they rated the services very, very favorably. So that was, I think a great confirmation.
It was so validating.
It was validating, right? And I think, in terms of, from a funding perspective, the state budget crisis is no mystery to folks in the room. And I think that any time we have hard data to support the fact that what we are doing is working is really fantastic for our advocacy purposes. So there'll be more on that later at the end of the presentation when we have a call to action for you all in the audience. So beyond core services, then participants gave us great information about what services were needed to sustain that safety. So after availing themselves of core services, many clients reported being stabilized, but there is a need then to sustain that safety. And so before we kind of turn to the 4 major areas that we heard from survivors about those needs, any additional thoughts on the core services findings?
I am so happy that they were included in there, because I do think as we are contemplating using this as a tool for funding or for advocacy in general, there is a tendency among organizations to bring the new, the shiny, the exciting, and our core services sometimes feel like they're none of the above. but it's important for us to continue to let people know that these core services are what allows people to stabilize their situation and to start to talk about these other needs. If they are not feeling safe, if they are still feeling like that their safety is compromised, the rest of the issues, which we will be talking about for the next half hour or so, we can't even get to that part of the conversation. So every time I have the opportunity, I want people to focus on that part of these findings.
Yes, I think that that's something certainly that our membership feels is a really critical component to the conversation because of the pressure to innovate. And I think that,
And I love innovation too, but
Right, of course. And I think, there's a space for that, but it's difficult to get a client to, engage in a program that looks at saving money for purchasing a home if she's having trouble, purchasing her next meal. So I think that core services are really critical to even contemplating sustaining safety. So thank you for that. So we'll start first with counseling. So you can see from the slides that participants reported a continuing and a new need for counseling services. So as Amy mentioned, participants in the survey were asked a series of questions at the time they engaged in services and then again 6 months later. And so the continuing need would be one that was reflected at both survey points. And the new need would be reflected after service engagement 6 months later. And you may be wondering, why would a participant report a new need for counseling when she hadn't previously identified that as a need? And I'm wondering, Amy, Lifespan has a robust counseling program. Would you care to speak to that?
Well, I think there's a variety of needs. I think that when clients first contact us, they probably are in crisis. So they have to deal with the crisis first before that they can seek long-term counseling. Or they may be, if they're getting an order of protection or they're trying to find immediate shelter, that all of those other needs take precedent. But I think the results we see on here really speak to I feel like the lasting effects of domestic violence, that the impact on the victim and their family, it doesn't go away after their immediate safety needs are taken care of. And so I think that as legal aid providers, that if you're working with a victim of domestic violence and perhaps they're not in crisis at the moment, but you're really seeing them, at the next phase, that know that they still have these ongoing needs and they may not be met. And it might explain, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about it later, some of the interactions that they're having with you.
Yeah, I think that, so another one of the findings is that a quarter of participants wanted family therapy. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, some of the impacts of domestic violence on how we see ourselves as part of a family, or...
At Lifespan, we tend to see that this new definition of family arises with our clients. So they do come in, and one of the main counseling needs they will have is that they come at it a couple different ways. Some come in and say, well, I've lost my family. So the abuser's no longer in the home, but I have children. We don't have a family anymore. So they experience everything from grief to just not knowing how to work within this new structure. And also they're dealing with children who may be blaming the parent, the victim, for why dad isn't here anymore. So, or maybe they've had to move because of this. So the kids are having a difficult time adjusting. And so then who will they take that out on? Their mom, because she's there. So the moms are often the recipient of all of these emotions, and they're children. They can't, they don't know where blame, lies. So that's a huge need we see. This really just sort of told Lifespan what we already knew, that our clients come in and that's one of the things they want.
Right, and I think you also see that a sizable percentage of participants reported needing help managing contact with the abuser. And for anyone here in the room who has touched a domestic relations case where domestic violence may be a present or prior element of that relationship dynamic, I'm not telling you anything new. And so I think, some of the conversation we've had with our network is about how do we meet this need when the provision of legal services is often time limited? I think, Margaret, when we were preparing for the panel, you mentioned, sort of the family law cases never die,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And we know that, particularly where an abuser and a survivor have children together, depending on the age of those children, these can be really ongoing challenges to the survivor's safety, to the children's safety, and just to well-being. We also know that there are tremendous visitation hurdles, and that's true of both visitation that's ordered through the Domestic Violence Division, but also the Domestic Relations Division. And if either of you'd like to talk about some of the shortage of the supervised visitation safe exchange services that are both free or
Can I talk about something else?
You can, yes, you may. Yeah.
What that made me think of was we were having a conversation in our office 2 days ago, and it was through business process analysis, talking about our cases and how we count what we're doing. And I think that the longevity of these cases is interesting for all the case handlers in the room. You know how hard it is when you have cases where your client has ongoing needs. You can't close the cases, but you also have more people coming in the door every day. And so how do you manage those ongoing needs? And one of the things that we realized was that our ongoing services to our clients, or maybe we're not capturing them adequately, or we're not structuring our office or our intake in a way that encourages or rewards attorneys for doing these long-term things that are going to be required, that our clients and survivors are telling us, I'm not done now. And it's true in the context of counseling, but it's certainly true in the context of litigation and in the ongoing managing contact with the abuser, which for the family law attorneys in the room, you know what that looks like in terms of visitation and child support and the endless permutations on those two issues. So,
and I think just sort of the huge universe of post-decree work,
yes,
that is out there, and folks are desperately
yes,
in need of legal aid resources.
Yes, and when it's not actually litigation, I mean, and that's what we were realizing, was that it might not be litigation, but it is still hours of work and of helping managing that contact, and for what it's worth, and it does matter how you count things and how you structure your work. We're not. That's just sort of going on under the radar as something that people are doing to help their clients,
right,
or their former clients,
right, and may also, depending on the legal representation you're providing, be impacting the progress of your cases. So, if there's a situation where a survivor and her former intimate partner share debt, and in contact with that former intimate partner is required to resolve this legal case. There may be some delays that appear to you as unnecessary or unproductive that are tied directly to a survivor's anxiety and true fear about interacting with that person. So,
but we could talk about supervised visitation too.
We sure could. No, that's fine.
Sorry for derailing.
I think it's worth a mention.
I mean, I think the issue, we know it's not called visitation anymore, but I think it's not just a lack of supervised visitation sites. I mean, we all know that it's twofold, that it's judges who won't order it. So I don't know what more there is to say about it, I think.
Yeah, I think what we hear from our members are that there are, the centers in the city that provide that service for free offer the service once a week. And for many survivors of domestic violence who wish to facilitate a relationship between their ex-partner and their children, once a week is not sufficient. And so the existing services are really not offered at an interval that is satisfactory to many. And then additionally, in the suburbs, those services are not generally available at a free or reduced cost basis. And I think there are many individuals, taking advantage of this need and advertising services as therapeutic where they may not be, and charging, incredible rates for an hour's worth of their time. So, we kind of see it across the board. So, related to counseling, some of the discussion has, tied into the legal discussion, but our recommendations are to maintain and build existing advocacy. So we have an appeals project through the Legal Assistance Foundation and Denton's that is examining, what are some effective strategies in obtaining relief for survivors who are using the court system and are required to have, continued contact with that abuser. Several member programs of the network have participated in a family court enhancement project that looks at really understanding the barriers to awarding child-related relief to varying degrees of success. I think we want to ensure that clients possess those referrals for counseling services when they leave us, because we don't know. They may not need it now, but they may need it 6 months later. I think we have to continue to advocate for safe child visitation options. A center isn't always an option, and so working with the client to identify a mutually agreeable location, party, circumstance for that visitation, and understand that despite a survivor's experience with her abuser, she may still want to facilitate a relationship between her children and her ex-partner. So that can be, kind of challenging to hold both worlds in your mind as a practitioner. Understand the need to manage the continued contact with the abuser, and I think we discussed in preparing for the panel, there are tools out there that can facilitate some of those, some of the safe communication between parties, or can create the record that one may need to avail themselves of if things become unsafe. And so just, kind of knowing the lay of the land and what's out there, what resources currently exist. So I'll turn us now to housing. Victims, so before I kind of get into the findings from the research, I think that as we were looking at the findings, we also saw a picture of poverty. The need for affordable, safe housing is not a need unique to domestic violence survivors. And so I think for us, we have to look at within that space then what are the additional needs that a survivor of domestic violence possesses. So nearly 1/3 of the participants identified in needing help finding permanent housing as a current need. And you can see that help with permanent housing was mentioned by a sizable percentage of Asian and Latino respondents. So, maintaining and building existing advocacy is a part of what we need to do. But as we mentioned at the start of the panel, we're interested in what other efforts that we can join in on, because it's not, again, a need unique to domestic violence survivors. So I think that, first I should ask Margaret and Amy, any particular surprises with these findings, and will this change in any way how you offer services or connect clients to resources?
Well, when you all read the report, because I know you will, what I find most impressive about this, actually we didn't share the stat with you, but 77% of clients at first contact, when they took the pre-survey, indicated a need for shelter. And then at 6 months, it was down to 5%. I mean, huge. I didn't think it would be that big, but I think that had to do with not only because they were able to find emergency shelter, but then also because there had been a number of interventions in the interim that allowed them maybe to maintain their current housing because maybe the order of protection gave them exclusive possession and things like that. So I just thought that was a remarkable statistic. What was your question?
That's fine. I nearly forgot it myself. I think it's about how any surprises with the findings, and then will this change how you deliver services or refer clients to resources?
When I saw these outcomes and then thought, okay, so now what do we do? What does Lifespan do to help with this? And really what sticks out most with me is, with a lot of these recommendations, is that we alone can't do it all. And even if we tried, we couldn't do it well. So it's really the importance of, and the excitement of being in this room is that sort of, that cross-sector collaboration. So if we have lawyers in the room, that their specialty is housing. So for us to work together, and that maybe, they come across it every once in a while, but it's not the focus of their practice. But we really should be working together, either through training, but really a more targeted collaborations, not just, I know I can refer you there, I know what you guys do, but we need to work more intentionally and more directly when it comes to the clients. But how? I'd love to hear from you.
I have no solutions, I just have more questions. I guess I was wondering, in terms of this housing section, is there anything, do we have any greater specificity as to exactly what the challenges are? Because, we see clients who don't have housing because they can't afford to rent an apartment. Right. And then I've had clients who've had terrible problems passing a credit check and can't get an apartment, right, even though they are making good salaries at good, steady W-2 jobs, and they have had a previous eviction and they can't get it.
Many times attributed to being in a relationship with domestic violence.
So do we have a sense at all about what sort of are the biggest issues, or are they all just big issues?
Well, I think so. The next issue that we'll look at is the financial employment piece, and I think that will tell us that I think a vast majority of participants in this survey would fall into your first category. So they're not, earning enough money to afford an apartment really anywhere in Chicago. And so we'll look at that more closely. But for example, participants in the survey reported doubling their income 6 months post-engagement of services. That doubling of income took the participant to an average of $16,000 a year. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty familiar with the neighborhoods in Chicago, and I think our researchers did a quick analysis. The only neighborhood where that sort of wage, would even put you in the realm of affording an apartment is on the southeast side in Hegwish. And I think that, when we hear survivors say they want safe, affordable housing, then, that becomes almost an impossible dream. So, yeah, yes.
Just, I wanted to tag into, it wasn't really an outgrowth of the outcome measures, but kind of like around the same time when the practitioners group started up. One of the first things that we had looked at was how difficult it was to get a judge to order child support and to get an enforceable child support order. And I think that probably the next piece is going to bring that to mind too, but the housing question also brings it to mind, because there are lots of times where if you don't have an enforceable order coming from the court, then that abuser knows that they can just cut the person off. And I mean, I've definitely had clients specifically come to me and say, I'm dropping the order and I'm not going to have a housing problem anymore because they're going to go back to the abusive situation because that is the best option for them. And I think that there's a lot of things that happen at the same time that maybe are not causally connected, but it's sort of worth knowing that that there have been real efforts made to make sure that the attorneys and legal aid agencies who are practicing in the courthouse are familiar with all the components of getting a uniform order of support entered and making sure that it gets to where it needs to go so that it can be enforced. And that seems to have corresponded with a period of time where we now have a bench at 555 that seems more connected to, if I don't enter this thing that is in the goal of the IDBA, then maybe this person's order of protection is not going to actually end the abuse. I think that some of the stuff that comes out in the outcome measure is worth keeping in mind if we ever see slippage in that area, because it really does articulate how important that piece can be, among a number of other pieces, but it's something where the machinery is there, it's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And so if it becomes a hurdle, it shouldn't be. So.
Well said, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, and that is the intention of child support, is to provide for housing. And so I think that's, we can't look at one without looking at the other. So what are we doing about it? I think this is one of those spaces where we can't be everywhere. I think Amy did a nice job talking about the immediate safety needs that shelter solves. But beyond shelter, that's really the challenge. And so some of our recommendations are advocating that both housing and transportation services include streamlined access for homeless domestic violence survivors. The status of experiencing domestic violence, rather, is a leading cause of homelessness. And so I think that our community and the homelessness service community need to be working better together. And so this is one area that I see ripe for meaningful collaboration legislatively. Also, looking at some of the housing benefit programs, and is there a priority given to a DV survivor? We've seen fabulous work done with getting veterans housed, and so how can that be replicated for a specialized population of domestic violence survivors? The city of Philadelphia, amended their housing ordinance to include domestic violence or survivors of domestic and sexual violence as protected classes when they're seeking housing, and so to ensure that discrimination doesn't exist based on that experience. And so I think there are ways that we can examine what we currently have as a quote-unquote safety net and how we can make that easier for survivors to access. I think the other pieces are transitional and longer-term shelter. Many shelters, cap their stays at 90 days unless the resident's been moved into a transitional housing program, and that's, there's simply just not enough beds available in those programs to move every individual who's in emergency shelter into that space. And so I think the more we can advocate for some of those rehabilitative periods, truly, to have people improve their credit or to find gainful employment, really mean that they won't return to the shelter in 18 months. and the longer-term housing options. So anything additional on housing before we move to the...
I was just wondering if we could poll the room
Yes.
quickly, if there are other, I mean, one of the things that we are hoping will come out of this project and has been in the works for a while is how can the domestic violence community work more closely, as Amy said, with other types of advocacy. And we have an internal penalty for the first person to use the word silo, so I'm buying drinks now for these ladies. But we have a group of people in the room now, and so if there are people who are doing housing work, we say, where are the tables we need to be? If you guys know of them, or are they in your work, do you have suggestions of, yes?
Yes.
I think the criminal justice community, you have an intersection with terms of employment, housing goals, and the fact that so many survivors also have been arrested or incarcerated themselves. We've seen the intersection between domestic violence and criminal justice with the legislation we worked on before.
Right.
And the same with the homeless community advocates. Same thing, TCH, we work hand in hand on reentry legislation because it's the same issues affecting people.
And that could be something small, like, can we support Ban the Box versus, and then something even, bigger. Okay, great. Fabulous. This is what we were hoping would happen, so thank you. I think that's critical.
But a question I had about that, in terms of the employment, I know you're not there yet, but you will be.
Yes.
What are the barriers to work when you're talking about that one?
Sure, yes, we'll get there shortly. Any other additional kind of tables that we should be at for housing?
Housing groups, housing subcommittees, housing initiatives,
Mm-hmm.
foreclosures.
And we know that there are programs in the room, foreclosure defense. We know that there are programs in the room that are likely serving domestic violence survivors. And so, if your thought doesn't come to you now, but it does later, I would sincerely invite you to contact any one of us. I think that the solutions aren't all going to rest within our community, and I think that I'll buy the next round, Margaret. We have to break out of our silos and work together. So, okay, so we'll move to the financial employment pieces. I cut to the chase earlier when I said the participants reported nearly doubling their income 6 months after engaging services, but the improvement is mostly attributed to enrollment in public welfare benefits. So most participants remained at or near the poverty level, and I think that I'd be remiss in moving on from this point without saying that those benefit programs may be in jeopardy. And so we can't take this piece for granted either. So, I think that we have to remain vigilant around block grants and, for instance, SNAP and some of these other benefits that we could count on to improve a survivor's economic standing quickly, right? 6 months is, I wish I could double my income in 6 months. So I think that that's one piece on the recommendation side we'll look more closely at. So over a quarter of participants reported a need with economic and material concerns. So that's permanent housing, as we discussed, emergency cash assistance, help with credit history, as Melanie mentioned, financial planning and literacy, food and clothing, healthcare, or work. And so, financial planning and literacy, I'll share with you an example that came up at another panel discussion. Many survivors are looking, if they've been out of the workforce for a while or they're wishing to improve their skills, their marketable skills, helping a survivor understand what training program is of quality and is going to help her become ready for a market that wants to hire her versus some of these, education institutions that are predatory. I mean, I think that, seeing the overlap of, some of the IT tech comes to mind, or some of the other, institutions, I'll use that term loosely, that take advantage of folks who are really looking to improve skills and are, leaving them with degrees and debt that is not necessarily helpful to their situation. So just wanted to mention that. Anything about these findings surprise you?
You spoke of employment. I mean, in this study, most people's employment stayed the same. So those who participated from the pre-test to the post-test, their employment status really did not change much. And that's why you see that their doubling of income was attributed to public benefits. So, I mean, there are a number of barriers to victims of domestic violence achieving employment. A number of years ago, the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development through the city and they had a project where they provided funding for agencies to work in getting domestic violence victims employed, and really they stopped funding it because the outcomes were so abysmal. In fact, they said, really sort of off the record, I can't remember if it's on the record, that victims of domestic violence were harder to not just place but maintain employment after the 1-year mark than ex-offenders. And so a lot of the barriers are actually related to poverty, so it's affordable, reliable transportation, it's childcare. I mean, you can't afford, even if we talked the other day about, the initiative for $15. I don't care if you have kids, you can't pay daycare and childcare, and go to work for even $15 an hour, let alone what it currently is. That's a major barrier. And so the majority of our clients, they have custody of their children. And there are no childcare subsidies anymore. So they can't even have a leg up with that. And then just a lot of factors. Maybe they do not have an employment history because of the abuser would not allow them to work. The abuser would not allow them to go to school, so they don't have the education. They've been out of the workforce for 10, 15 years. So there's a lot of job readiness work that has to be done with a victim to get them to the employment piece.
Right. So I think that, in looking at our core services, I think that this piece too is one of those areas where I think we as a community offer the least. And I think that, over the years, there have been different initiatives by trying to offer financial empowerment curriculums through counseling or through court advocacy. And I think you've heard us mention a few times that many of those core services are focused with a client during a time of heightened crisis. And so it's not necessarily the time to integrate some of these this curriculum into our service provision. And so the challenge is, how do we get this information to survivors in a way that helps them make positive decisions moving forward and rehabilitate some of the challenges they may be experiencing by virtue of being in that relationship. And so how do we do that at the same time, sort of keeping those urgent needs at the forefront? And so we have a few recommendations, but again, we're inviting suggestions for more. So remaining vigilant and joining in any efforts to offset threats to existing benefit programs. That includes legislative action at the state level for some of the block grants. What other efforts can we join? So I'll open that up in just a moment. Providing more emergency assistance to survivors and easing restrictions for survivors. So we know that and it's also making full use of existing exemptions. There's an exemption in the TANF benefits. TANF benefits, as you know, are time limited to 60 months or 5 years. And there's a domestic violence exemption that essentially stops the clock for a survivor. But are we making full use of that? Are we remaining? I think the answer may be no. And if not, why not? And then just ensuring that those types of exemptions continue to exist. I think advocating for more support for complex financial issues, identity theft, fraud, recouping poor credit. I never underestimate an abuser's capacity to use, any opportunity to exert power and control over a survivor, and that includes, anything to do with resources. Collaborating on financial empowerment programs that explore non-traditional green sector and tech jobs. I think that, we really have to work on getting survivors linked to quality training programs and jobs so they can be economically self-sufficient, regardless of whether the judge orders child support or whether that order is enforced. And engage in diverse economic empowerment. We serve a ton of undocumented survivors. They may not be eligible for job training programs that are funded, by federal streams. And so how do we make sure that those survivors aren't left out of these discussions? Many survivors are so resourceful, and they have developed ways to earn a cash income. How can we support those efforts? So are there any suggestions from the audience about additional conversations we can be participating in, or yes?
I'm thinking that one of my partners for human services, because a lot of the social service needs are likely being negatively impacted, not just by the state crisis, but in general.
Right.
That a good partnership and collaboration of Metropolitan Family Services offers a lot of those social services, but as you can imagine, can't handle all of it. So we do have a Center for Working Families that does economic stability work, and we do some homelessness preservation, a variety of issues, but if we collectively get to the table and address some of those issues jointly, social service, human services, legal aid,
Right.
I think we'd have a stronger voice.
Thank you for that. I will be following up with you. I think, anytime we can expand our base, right? Expand our base.
The statewide agency comprised of about 800 different social service agencies, of which I'm on the executive board for.
Yeah, you have a lot of muscle. Anything else on the economic piece? I think, efforts like Fight for 15, looking critically at SEIU's push to for overtime pay for home health care workers. I think we have to, as a service provider, we have to think about the spaces our clients occupy once they leave our space, right? Once they leave our office, are they going to a job where they're a home health care worker, a CNA? And so, how can we lift up join in those other fights and lift up those other causes? So I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about. I'm really excited about the possibility. And I think that I will say also, I think that even in the shifting political landscape, the idea of putting someone to work who wants to work is really appealing. There's a bipartisan appeal, I think, to getting people to work. So I'm hoping that can be where we can direct some energy. So on to the legal. We saved the best for last.
And we have 10 minutes to do it.
Great.
All right.
That's fabulous. Complete and safe separation from an abuser requires significant legal resources. We know that, both immediately and in the long term, especially where there are children involved. So participants are reporting new and continuing needs for assistance with those pieces, right? The visitation, the child custody, divorce, and as well as immigration. Did any of these findings surprise either of you?
No.
Yeah, right. Right. I think the busy signal when we call your intake line tells us all we need to know, right? So let's talk about the recommendations. We need to maintain and build existing advocacy. I think that obviously legal service corp money is top of mind for many of you in the audience. What will be the impact on LSC money going forward? How can we be helpful in advocating with you, alongside of you, as you seek to preserve and grow, right, those dollars? We can demonstrate for you. We have the facts that support an appetite for your services, and so we'd like to offer to join you in those conversations. And I think we also, need to continue to advocate for civil legal services. We know that's what our community can provide in a limited way, but that our survivors have many more legal needs beyond domestic relations. We'd like to support any of your efforts to advocate for sliding scale legal services and increases in the safe exchange, supervised visitation safe exchange services. So what other ways can we work together to ensure that survivors' legal needs are met? Any ideas?
It's such an easy question. I don't know why people aren't giving us answers.
Well, one of the things that came through, I think, fairly clearly is that we have historically thought of the legal component of a domestic violence survivor's journey as being one of order of protection and domestic relations, and then immigration, and seeing it much more broadly as the consumer issues, the affordable housing, that this is while we are a specialty practice, that it is by no means the only, or maybe sometimes the best way to provide legal services to survivors. So how do we expand the way that we think about that? And that is an organizational and a community challenge for all of us, I think.
Well, exactly. That's what brought us to achieving safety, but for long-term sustaining that safety, that's how we have to look broader than what we're currently doing.
Is there any sense, and I know you mentioned child custody and divorce, but there's nothing in here explicitly about child support or contribution to child care or contribution to medical expenses or specifically financial remedies? Is there any sense, I mean, you've got the financial need and you've got the legal piece, is there any sense to what degree it's remedies that have been court ordered that aren't being enforced? Or aren't being, or there's no access anyway because someone's in the wind? Or, I mean, is there any sense? It's not a great phrased question, but I think you guys know what I'm saying, right?
I do. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the questions on the survey, but a lot of the answers are dependent on the way that we asked it. And of course, we know that people identify problems according to the definitions that we provide them with A, B, C, and D. So that is my suspicion. Megan might have more
But
familiarity with what we asked.
I think we also have to look at this as to who was who the participants were in the
Yes.
survey.
Uh-huh.
Of all the participating agencies, only 2 provide legal services. So if you look at that, so people who are being surveyed, they may not have access to those legal services.
Right.
So it's really hard to pinpoint the answers to your question, but I feel like that is telling of itself. So it's not as though all the people who participated received legal services. A lot of those people did not receive legal services because they may just be in a counseling program, or maybe they had criminal court advocacy, but they have not used the civil legal service remedies.
So yeah, and I think just 2 interesting points to take away from that. One is that, folks who remained engaged with our community 6 months post first engaging with us are likely to have, different answers than someone who first engaged with us and then never did again, or folks who never knew we existed to help them. And so I think that kind of speaks to our survey sample. The other piece is the survey itself. And so this project is ongoing, and I think, in the coming months we'll be taking a hard look at the survey, the questions we're asking, how we're asking, and I think that that's a great takeaway from this afternoon's discussion is, as we talk about the economic pieces, how are we linking those up to, existing relief that should be available under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, and really ensuring that we're asking.
Experience with the state's attorney following child support, that even if they're not linked with a civil legal service provider, that there's, they're ordering contribution to medical expenses. Is anyone enforcing that? Is anyone?
Great.
And I would imagine that a lot of that is still yet to come. We often know that a simple divorce will likely be done in 6 or 7 months, but a very complicated one takes 2 years to figure it out. So we might not yet know about those post-decree issues that, and folks might not be able to identify them unless we ask the right questions. But I would imagine post-decree issues are a huge concern.
Kevin?
Yeah, was there any division in the questions or looking at the answers of survivors who experienced the economic problems because of the abuse and separation versus survivors whose families just always experience these issues where, abuser may be facing, somewhat ironically, the same barriers?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
So it's like, it just feels like the solution will come fix poverty.
Right.
Exactly. Yes.
That's a good point, because even if there hasn't been civil legal service involvement, or even if nothing has been ordered, the question then is this something that civil legal service involvement could potentially remedy, or?
Because he's not a W-2 wage earner anyway. He never provided a dime when they were together, so.
Right. Okay, that's a great question. I think something to look at when we go back to the survey.
Yeah, because it's definitely worth keeping in mind that, among the clients that you see at, free legal aid, it's people who there's no resources on the other side, and it's also people where, whatever resources are on the other side is not worth, the fire that they're going to have to walk through to get that. I would rather make do on, with my DV flagged public benefits case than try to ask this person for child support. If you put me on child support, I'll kill you. All that kind of stuff. It's not just as simple as we should always get child support from the other side. But it also, where it does line up, you should not be encountering resistance. And part of it, I think, might be that it doesn't come up as much as you think it would, and therefore it's new to the judges when they see it. They're like, why would we do this?
Can I ask 4 questions, but they're quick and they go in a row like
Go
that?
ahead.
So you said there's 450 participants that did this survey. How many came from Margaret and Amy's agency?
We had about 70 from Lifespan.
And I don't know the answer.
Not less than 50.
Yes, less than 50.
I can't see your faces. At the 6-month mark, were they always full representation cases you were following through with? Or could it have been a brief service that had come through that you had?
They had to have come in at least twice. So for our office, the first time would have been filing the petition for the emergency order of protection, and so we would have accepted them for representation at how the case had concluded. It could vary.
What about you? Was it
It
totally
varied. Most of them came in, they would have been within the first 6 months of their case, really from door. So really, they could have been 3 months into their case. So maybe there hadn't been even a child support hearing yet, or Most of them were current clients still, but some dropped out. Some just needed legal information. But we really tried to target those who received our services, so more than just information and referral.
Right, 'cause that was one of the questions about what the status of the case was at that 6-month mark. Were they still open and continuing their legal cases? Were they closed? Or they buried it?
I mean, I would argue that most of them were just in the inception.
Yeah. And who conducted the follow-up by your agencies? Was it the attorneys that handled the cases? Because like we have social workers that do our follow-up phone calls. How did you do it?
We designated one person on staff who is an attorney who managed everything. Yeah. One person on staff who handled all of it. It was an attorney, but it didn't need to be. It was someone who is really organized and good at spreadsheets. That's
And I think, and honestly, I think that's what key, and that's what we found out early on, that the agencies that were really struggling with having participants were those that did not have a designated person or two to do this work, because then it just fell on everyone's shoulder. It's hard to monitor that. It's hard to prioritize that. As an attorney who's litigating a case, we actually had 2 bilingual, which was key, because this was done in several languages, not enough, but several, bilingual paralegals who were devoted to the project.
That's great. And then the last question, new needs that arose. So our social workers, when they're doing those follow-up, like how stable are you now? And when we were just doing surveys and hearing all these new needs, we weren't necessarily addressing them. And we realized we can't commit to following up with clients unless we can commit to providing something to them. Because otherwise it's like, oh, you had this unstable housing situation.
talking to
Right.
you.
Right.
Yeah.
So how did you handle that?
Well,
That's a great question.
technically, you know how we tweaked this a bit is in practice. Technically, it was not supposed to be. You were not supposed to sit and ask them the questions so that they would honestly answer. So it's not as though the person who was representing them would sit there and say, "How am I doing?" You know, like, "How you doing?" They could do it online, or we could mail them a survey and they could mail it back, so that it remained confidential. So they may not have directly told anyone on staff that they're still struggling with these issues.
Or that they weren't satisfied with the service.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we won't know individually. If people were not satisfied with our services, we won't know who.
So that's a drawback in some ways, and in other ways it allows
But
for...
it's essential for a
Right.
survey of this kind.
Right. So, as one of my colleagues in the audience says, what's your ask? So you're here, you've listened to our findings, you've engaged in discussion, so for that we thank you. But what can we do now? So a few things. I think most urgently, you'll see in the final slide, is that domestic violence services were left out of the stopgap budget that was passed at the end of last fiscal year. And that is late-breaking information, I'm sorry to say. So despite some assurances we had received that we were included in some of the lump sum DHS money, we were not. So
all these core services?
Right. So core services are in jeopardy. And I think if you have a gift to give this holiday season, I would ask that you make 3 calls for us at some point between now and Monday. If we're really advocating that domestic violence victim line item, general revenue funding be obligated in the stopgap budget. Ensure that any additional budgetary measures for FY17 include our full line item, which is $18 million for the whole state. So that is sort of the most urgent. So if you can find space in your day to do that for us, I think that survivors of domestic violence will benefit. And I think the next piece is the conversation we've been having all afternoon, which is we do a great job at stabilizing survivors and meeting immediate safety needs, but I think we have to look externally to sustain that safety. And so I think I'm leaving here with some really great ideas about some tables to sit at and some places to be and conversations to have, but I would encourage you to continue providing suggestions or putting me on the list for your meeting if you think that we can be a helpful presence there. So again, the full report is on both the Battered Women's Network website as well as the Loyola Center for Urban Research and Learning's website. And just 2 questions I want to leave you with is, how may a client's status as a domestic violence survivor be impacting your case as a legal aid attorney, no matter what area you practice in? And And if you are encountering that and you're thinking differently about the needs of your client, know that we exist as a resource for those conversations. And that may kind of explain sometimes the unexplainable behavior of our clients in advancing their cases. And again, what can we do as a DV community to help our clients best utilize your representation? I think that we have to acknowledge that some of the protections, like confidentiality, that are put in place to make sure that our clients are safe, sometimes act as a barrier to kind of free exchange of information that could best meet the legal needs of a survivor, and we have to acknowledge
And this
that.
is outside of privilege and confidentiality, which we are all accustomed to. This
Right,
is an
thank you for the
additional layer
clarification.
of confidentiality on
Right.
some advocacy services.
Exactly, thank you. So, we're committed to looking critically at how we deliver services and how that can be improved so that we can work better together to meet the needs of survivors of domestic violence. So I want to thank you for your attention. And it sounds like you have a few other things on your agenda, so Cliff, you're welcome to come back up. Thanks again, thank you.
Thank you to our panel, and most importantly, thank you for the work that you do for a group of people that clearly need an integration of legal and social services during a very extraordinary, difficult time in their life. So thank you for what you do.